In the beginning, long before Babylon became a name whispered with awe and fear across the ancient world, it was nothing more than a settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River. The land itself seemed ordinary at first glance, flat plains stretching into the horizon, punctuated only by the winding river and patches of fertile soil. Yet this seemingly modest geography contained the seeds of destiny. The Euphrates was both a giver and a taker of life. Its annual floods nourished the fields, but its unpredictable nature also brought destruction. For the earliest settlers, it was both a blessing and a curse. They learned to channel the river with canals and irrigation, transforming desert into farmland. In this harsh balance between survival and opportunity, Babylon's foundations were laid. The settlement began as a cluster of mud brick houses, nothing that would catch the eye of future empires. Mud brick, cheap, abundant, and fragile, was the building material of choice. In the fierce heat of Mesopotamia, where rain was scarce and stone was almost non-existent, these sun-dried bricks were stacked to form homes, walls, and temples. They crumbled easily, melted back into the earth, and required constant rebuilding. Yet, paradoxically, it was this impermanence that shaped Mesopotamian civilization. Cities rose and fell, but their memories and stories endured, preserved on clay tablets rather than in stone monuments. Babylon's earliest incarnation was no exception, a settlement destined to rise again and again from the same soil. By the 19th century BCE, Babylon had begun to assert itself. At first, it was one among many competing city-states that dotted Mesopotamia. Names like Uruk, and Lagash had already carved their places into history. Babylon, still relatively obscure, was simply another participant in the endless rivalry for water, trade routes, and fertile land. Yet geography was on Babylon's side. Positioned at a crossroads between the north and south of Mesopotamia, and lying directly on the great river highways, it became a hub for merchants, soldiers, and scribes. Caravans carrying lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and tin from Anatolia passed through its gates. Over time, trade wove Babylon into the economic fabric of the ancient Near East, transforming it from a provincial town into a city with ambition. But Babylon's leap from obscurity into greatness came under one man, Hammurabi. Ascending the throne around 1792 BCE, Hammurabi was not initially seen as a ruler destined for glory. Babylon was small compared to rivals like Larsa or Mari. Yet Hammurabi possessed both patience and vision. For decades, he maneuvered diplomatically, forging alliances when needed, breaking them when advantageous, and slowly expanding his control. War was his tool, but so too was strategy. Step by step, he subdued his neighbors, until Babylon no longer stood in the shadow of greater powers. It had become the power. By the time of Hammurabi's death, his kingdom stretched across Mesopotamia, and Babylon was the shining capital of an empire. Yet the city's grandeur should not be imagined as endless palaces of marble and towers of stone. The reality was humbler, even fragile. Though Hammurabi's rule created political unity, the physical Babylon remained a city of mud brick, its streets alive with dust, noise, and commerce. Merchants shouted in marketplaces, donkeys brayed as they pulled carts through narrow lanes, children splashed in irrigation canals. The city walls rose high, but they were made of the same crumbling material as the houses within. If Babylon seemed eternal in legend, in reality it was always vulnerable to time, weather, and war. Still, the empire Hammurabi built was more than bricks and canals. It was an empire of ideas. His famous code of laws, inscribed on stone and clay, gave Babylon an aura of order and justice, even if, in practice, justice often favored the powerful. These laws were not just tools of governance but symbols of civilization itself. They projected the image of a society that valued fairness, even as inequality remained entrenched. Hammurabi's reign planted the idea that Babylon was not just another Mesopotamian city, but a beacon of human progress, a place where culture, trade, and law flourished together. Yet Babylon's rise was never smooth or permanent. After Hammurabi, the empire fractured. Enemies from beyond Mesopotamia invaded, and Babylon fell into decline. But this pattern, of ascent, collapse, and rebirth, became the city's defining rhythm. Unlike many ancient capitals that disappeared forever after conquest, Babylon had an uncanny ability to return. Its location, its river, and its symbolic weight ensured that conquerors could not resist restoring it. Each time it was destroyed, it re-emerged, reshaped by new rulers yet retaining its name, its spirit, and its central place in Mesopotamian life. Life for ordinary Babylonians during these early centuries was far removed from the grandeur of royal inscriptions. Most were farmers, bound to the cycles of the river and the demands of irrigation. They worked under the sun, planting barley and wheat, paying taxes in grain, and serving in the king's labor projects. In villages surrounding the city, they built levees and dug canals, their sweat and toil sustaining both themselves and the urban elites. Their reward was survival, though famine and hardship were constant threats. In the city itself, artisans and traders thrived, producing pottery, textiles, and tools. The wealthy elite, landowners, priests, and scribes, collected the fruits of this labor, while the poor lived precariously, their mud brick homes offering little against disease or disaster. What made Babylon unique, even in these early days, was not just its wealth or power but its ability to capture the imagination. To live in Babylon was to be part of something larger than oneself. Its ziggurats rose like stairways to heaven, its markets buzzed with the accents of distant lands, and its priests told stories of gods who battled in cosmic wars. These myths tied the city's people to a shared identity, convincing them that their toil was part of a divine plan. Whether farmer or king, Babylonian or foreigner, everyone who entered its gates became part of a story that outlived them. Thus, Babylon's birth was not a single moment but a process, a slow gathering of people, power, and ideas on the banks of the Euphrates. It was fragile in material, yet powerful in symbol. A city born from mud and water, yet destined to shape myths that would echo across millennia. The foundations of Babylon were not only in the sand and soil but in the collective belief of its people, and it was this belief, more than its walls or armies, that ensured Babylon would not vanish like so many other cities of the ancient world. When later generations spoke of Babylon, they rarely forgot to mention its walls. Herodotus, writing centuries after the city's prime, described them as so vast and thick that chariots could race atop them. They were said to be 60 miles in circumference, glittering with baked brick, rising toward the heavens as if defying the very earth beneath. The Ishtar Gate, adorned with blue-glazed tiles and decorated with images of dragons and bulls, became a symbol of the city's majesty. Travelers who passed through it must have felt they were stepping into another world, a place touched by the gods themselves. These monuments made Babylon a legend, a city remembered not only for its power but for its spectacle. And yet, beyond these monumental facades, the truth of Babylon was not one of eternal splendor, but of crowded homes, muddy alleyways, and the constant press of ordinary life. Inside the city walls, the grandeur gave way to something much less poetic. Babylon was alive with people, merchants, farmers, scribes, priests, slaves, all packed within its gates. The population may have reached over 200,000 at its height, making it one of the largest cities of the ancient world. But with such numbers came all the complications of density. The wide ceremonial roads that led to temples and palaces quickly gave way to twisting lanes, so narrow that two carts could not pass side by side. The houses, built of mud brick like so much of Mesopotamia, leaned toward each other, their upper stories nearly touching across the street. Shade was welcome in the brutal sun, but the darkness of those alleys also trapped foul smells and made them difficult to clean. A walk through the common quarters of Babylon would have been an assault on the senses. The air was filled with the scent of baking bread, brewing beer, animal dung, and refuse left to rot. Open drains ran along the streets, carrying away waste but often overflowing during floods. Dogs and goats wandered freely, scavenging what they could. Children played in the dust while merchants called out their prices from stalls piled with dates, onions, and fish pulled from the Euphrates. Life was noisy, dirty, and unrelenting. For most Babylonians, this was the reality, not the dazzling blue of the Ishtar gate, but the gray-brown of mud brick walls and the constant hum of survival. Yet the contrast between monument and alley was intentional. The rulers of Babylon wanted their city to project power and divinity. The walls and gates were not only for defense but also for spectacle. When foreign envoys approached, the towering structures proclaimed the wealth and authority of Babylon's kings. The Ishtar Gate in particular was designed to awe, its surface covered in brilliant tiles that caught the sun, its animals, mythical dragons representing Marduk, fierce bulls symbolizing Adad, marching in procession toward the heart of the city. Passing through such a gate was meant to impress upon every visitor that they had entered a place chosen by the gods, a center of the world. But once inside, visitors saw something else, a city both vibrant and precarious. The mud brick that formed its buildings was cheap and plentiful but also fragile. After heavy rains, walls melted, after years of heat, they cracked. Households constantly repaired their homes, patching walls, rebuilding rooms, and even tearing down and remaking entire structures. For archaeologists today, this endless rebuilding has left Babylon's remains layered like a cake, with new houses built atop the ruins of old ones, a literal record of centuries of rise and decay. Water, though life-giving, was also a constant threat. The Euphrates ran directly through Babylon, splitting the city into east and west. Canals and levees tried to tame it, but floods could breach defenses, pouring into the streets and homes. In dry seasons, the river shrank, limiting trade and irrigation. To live in Babylon was to live with the river's moods, never fully safe, always dependent. And with water came disease. Stagnant canals bred insects, contaminated drains spread sickness. No wall, no matter how high, could keep out the dangers lurking in the streets. And yet, there was life, energy, and even beauty in the hidden quarters of Babylon. Within the narrow streets, artisans shaped clay into pottery, spun wool into textiles, and carved ivory into ornaments. Bakers stoked their ovens before dawn, filling the city with the smell of fresh bread. Brewers supplied the beer that was as much a staple as water. Families gathered on rooftops in the evening, seeking relief from the heat, watching the stars that their priests and astronomers charted so carefully. The streets may have been chaotic, but they pulsed with the rhythm of daily existence, the small rituals that bound the city together. The social divide between the wealthy and the poor was most visible in the city's architecture. While most people lived in modest one- or two-room houses, the elite occupied larger compounds with courtyards, storage rooms, and private shrines. Their walls were sometimes plastered or painted, their floors paved with baked bricks instead of packed dirt. From these homes, the wealthy controlled the city's trade, land, and politics, yet even they were not entirely removed from the fragility of mud brick and the stench of nearby drains. No one in Babylon, however rich, could fully escape the conditions of urban life. For all its flaws, Babylon's density also created opportunity. Markets flourished in its busy lanes, where goods from faraway lands mingled with local produce. Foreigners brought their languages, dress, and customs, making Babylon a cosmopolitan hub. Within the same street, one might hear an Akkadian merchant bargaining with an Elamite trader, while a scribe recorded contracts in cuneiform. Diversity was both the city's strength and its challenge, binding it to the wider world even as it struggled to hold itself together. The great walls and hidden streets of Babylon represent two faces of the same city. The walls stood as symbols, projecting might, permanence, and divine favor. The streets revealed the truth, a fragile, human place where survival depended on mud brick repairs, careful water management, and the daily efforts of ordinary people. This duality is what made Babylon both legendary and real. To outsiders, it was the city of wonders. To those who lived there, it was home, with all the noise, smells, and struggles that came with it. And yet, these contradictions gave Babylon its character. Behind the majestic facade of kings and gates lay the beating heart of a city full of humanity. Every crack in the mud brick, every shout in the marketplace, every ritual at a household shrine reminded its people that they lived in a place both precarious and extraordinary. Babylon's walls could guard them from invaders, but within, life went on in all its messy reality. That tension, between splendor and squalor, was what made the city unforgettable. Among the treasures of Babylon's legacy, few artifacts speak more loudly than the black basalt stele of Hammurabi's code. Standing over 7 feet tall, its surface is carved with nearly 300 laws, each line pressed into stone with the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform. At its top, Hammurabi himself is depicted standing before Shamash, the god of justice, receiving authority to rule and legislate. It is an image carefully crafted, the king as shepherd, chosen by the gods, bringing order to a chaotic world. To later generations, this code would symbolize the dawn of written law. To those who lived under it, however, it was both a promise and a warning, a shield for some and a weapon against others. Hammurabi ruled Babylon in the 18th century BCE, and he knew that power was not won by conquest alone. Conquerors could fall, but a ruler who controlled the very definition of justice could shape society for generations. His code was less a new invention than a collection of customs and precedents already practiced across Mesopotamia. Yet by inscribing them into stone and placing the monument in public view, he elevated those practices into something divine, something immutable. It was not just a law, it was propaganda, telling his subjects that order flowed through him, from God to king to people. The laws themselves reveal much about the world of Babylon. They covered everything from theft and trade to marriage, slavery, and inheritance. Some seem surprisingly modern: contracts must be written and witnessed, disputes settled by judges, merchants held accountable for fraud. Others strike us with their brutality. The principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was not metaphorical but literal. If a man put out the eye of another, his own eye was to be destroyed. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed its owner, the builder was put to death. If it killed the owner's son, the builder's son was executed. Responsibility and punishment extended beyond the guilty, binding entire families to the weight of justice. Yet beneath the surface of fairness lay a clear hierarchy. The code divided society into 3 categories: the Awilu, or free and wealthy citizens, the Mushkenu, or commoners, and slaves. The same crime carried different consequences depending on the victim's class. If an Awilu harmed another Awilu, retribution was direct and harsh. But if the victim was a commoner, the penalty was often monetary. And if the victim was a slave, the punishment was little more than compensation to the master. Justice, therefore, was not blind in Babylon, it saw rank and status with perfect clarity. Women too were bound tightly within this system. Marriage was treated as a contract, not a romance, with dowries carefully recorded and rights tied to family honor. A wife accused of adultery could be drowned in the river if convicted. Yet not all laws were entirely one-sided. A woman whose husband neglected her could, under certain conditions, leave him and take her dowry back. Widows and priestesses received protections regarding property. Still, in most matters, men held the advantage, and the code reinforced the patriarchal structure of Babylonian society. Trials under Hammurabi's law carried a mixture of solemn ritual and chilling unpredictability. Evidence and witnesses were sought, but when certainty was lacking, the gods were called upon to judge. One infamous method was the river ordeal. The accused would be thrown into the Euphrates. If the river swallowed him, the gods had declared him guilty; if he survived, he was innocent and his accuser was punished. In this system, divine power was woven into civic life, binding the authority of law with the mysteries of fate. For the common Babylonian, justice was as much a matter of survival as truth. The stele itself was not likely consulted by ordinary people, many of whom were illiterate. Instead, scribes and judges interpreted the laws, ensuring that power remained in the hands of those educated enough to wield it. For most, Hammurabi's code was not a practical reference but a symbol looming above them, a reminder etched in stone that the king's will was everywhere. It was less about resolving every dispute and more about shaping perception. Hammurabi wanted his subjects to believe they lived in a world where order was absolute, even if daily reality was messy and chaotic. Archaeological evidence suggests that, despite its fame, the code did not eliminate corruption or inequality. Judges were often bribed, officials manipulated rulings, and the wealthy found ways to avoid punishment. But the existence of the code created an ideal to aspire to, or at least to display. Even if the laws were unevenly applied, their presence gave Babylon an aura of sophistication, distinguishing it from the lawless chaos of tribal life or distant frontiers. In this sense, Hammurabi succeeded. He branded his city not just as powerful, but as civilized, a beacon of order in a turbulent world. For the ordinary Babylonian, living under this system meant walking a narrow line. The farmer who failed to maintain his irrigation canal could be heavily fined if his negligence flooded a neighbor's field. The merchant who cheated in trade risked having his hands cut off. The doctor whose surgery failed could pay with his life. These harsh measures were not just punishments, they were deterrents. They reminded everyone that Babylon was a society where mistakes carried consequences, where survival depended on obedience, skill, and luck. Yet in the midst of its severity, the code also provided some sense of stability. Contracts for land, loans, and marriages were enforced. Widows and orphans had recourse, however limited. Farmers and merchants could, at least in theory, appeal to the law instead of the whims of stronger men. The system was imperfect, skewed toward the powerful, but it gave Babylon a foundation upon which to grow. The question remains, was Hammurabi's code truly justice, or was it control? Perhaps it was both. It restrained chaos and provided order, but it also reinforced hierarchy, ensuring that power flowed downward, never upward. For Hammurabi, that was the point. The laws were not simply about fairness, they were about cementing his rule in the hearts and minds of his subjects. By claiming divine authority for his code, he made obedience not just a civic duty, but a sacred one. And so the basalt stele stands, millennia later, as a testament to the complexity of Babylonian life. To modern eyes, it may seem harsh, even cruel, yet for its time it was revolutionary, the idea that society could be governed by a written code rather than the shifting moods of kings. In Babylon, justice was a double-edged sword, part protection, part instrument of control, forever binding its people to the will of their ruler and the gaze of their gods. If there was one thing that united every Babylonian, from king to slave, it was food. The rituals of eating and drinking formed the rhythm of daily life, revealing not only what people consumed but who they were, what they valued, and how they related to the land that sustained them. At the heart of Babylon's cuisine was a humble but powerful staple, barley. This hardy grain grew well in the irrigated fields of the Euphrates Valley, and from it came bread and beer, the two foundations of the Babylonian diet. To eat bread and drink beer was to be Babylonian, it was survival, culture, and identity bound into a single meal. Bread was everywhere, in countless forms. Archaeological evidence and cuneiform tablets suggest more than 50 varieties were baked: flatbreads, loaves, rolls, even bread sweetened with dates or enriched with oils. The poor ate simple flat cakes baked on hot stones, coarse and filling, while the wealthy enjoyed breads with spices, cheese, or honey. In every home, ovens glowed with heat as women kneaded dough, shaping it with practiced hands before slipping it into clay domes lined with embers. The smell of baking bread wafted through narrow streets, a daily reminder of both labor and comfort. For most families, a meal without bread was unthinkable. But bread alone could not satisfy thirst in a hot, dusty city. Here, beer reigned supreme, not the frothy drink of modern pubs, but a thick, porridge-like brew made from fermented barley. It was consumed through straws to filter out husks and sediment. Beer was cheap, nutritious, and safer than water, which was often polluted by drains and canals. Workers received it as rations, priests offered it to the gods, and families drank it at every meal. There were many varieties, some light and mild, others strong and intoxicating. To drink beer was both sustenance and social glue, binding people together in taverns, markets, and homes. Even the gods, according to myths, delighted in drinking beer, and rituals often included pouring libations onto the earth as offerings. Beyond bread and beer, the Babylonian table reflected the abundance of Mesopotamia's fertile crescent. Dates were treasured above all fruits, their sweetness a gift of the palm groves lining the riverbanks. They were eaten fresh, dried, or pressed into syrup. Fish from the Euphrates filled markets, carp, catfish, and eels smoked or stewed in clay pots. Vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and cucumbers were staples, flavoring stews that simmered over household fires. Lentils and chickpeas provided protein for the poor, while richer households added lamb, goat, or beef to their pots. Meat was expensive and not eaten daily by commoners, but on festivals or special occasions, roasting lamb on spits or boiling mutton for stew brought families together in celebration. Spices and herbs, though limited compared to later cuisines, added variety. Coriander, cumin, and mustard seeds were ground for flavoring. Sesame oil, pressed from locally grown sesame seeds, was widely used in cooking, giving dishes a nutty richness. Honey sweetened desserts and drinks, though it was rare and prized. Salt was drawn from marshlands and traded across Mesopotamia, crucial both for seasoning and for preserving fish and meat in a hot climate where food spoiled quickly. Banquets in Babylon displayed the extreme contrast between rich and poor. For ordinary families, meals were simple: bread, beer, perhaps some onions, dates, and lentils, with meat reserved for special occasions. But in the palaces of kings and the houses of wealthy merchants, food became a spectacle of power. Historical texts and later accounts describe feasts with roasted game, abundant beer and wine, fruits piled high, and entertainers performing for guests. Banquets were more than meals, they were political theaters, moments when kings displayed wealth and generosity to allies, subjects, and foreign envoys. To dine at the table of a Babylonian ruler was to experience the empire's abundance, carefully staged to impress. Cooking itself was an art recorded in some of the earliest recipes known to history. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia preserve instructions for preparing stews with meat, vegetables, spices, and broth, evidence that Babylonian cuisine was not merely functional but sophisticated. These recipes called for balancing flavors and textures, suggesting that cooks sought not only to feed but to delight. Food was a marker of status. A man who could afford seasoned stews and sweet pastries distinguished himself from those who ate only coarse bread and weak beer. Yet even the simplest meal carried meaning, tying families to the land, to each other, and to the gods who were believed to bless the harvest. Religion infused the Babylonian table at every level. Before meals, offerings were often set aside for household gods. Temples received vast quantities of grain, beer, and livestock as sacrifices, and priests redistributed this food to support temple workers and rituals. The gods were imagined as feasting alongside humans, consuming the smoke of roasted meats, savoring the scent of baked bread. Festivals brought entire communities together in shared meals, reinforcing bonds of faith and identity. Eating was never merely physical, it was spiritual, a way of participating in the cosmic order. Yet hunger was never far away. In times of drought, flood, or war, food supplies collapsed. Grain shortages drove up prices, forcing the poor to starve while the wealthy hoarded reserves. Tablets record complaints of unfair rations, of people driven into debt and slavery when they could no longer feed their families. In such times, the contrast between the banquets of kings and the empty bowls of laborers was stark. The same bread and beer that symbolized life could also become reminders of inequality and desperation. Still, in the daily act of preparing meals, Babylon's people found continuity. The farmer bending over barley fields, the brewer stirring vats of fermenting mash, the mother baking flatbreads for her children, all participated in the cycle of sustenance that defined Babylonian life. Food was not only nourishment but memory, connecting generations through recipes and rituals. To this day, when archaeologists uncover charred grains or broken beer jars in the ruins of Babylon, they are uncovering fragments of those forgotten lives, the ordinary meals that sustained an extraordinary city. In the end, the story of Babylon's food is the story of the city itself, a blend of abundance and fragility, celebration and struggle, survival and display. Bread and beer filled the bellies of workers, dates sweetened the mouths of children, banquets displayed the wealth of kings. From the humblest meal in a cramped mud brick home to the most lavish feast under gilded ceilings, food defined what it meant to live in Babylon. It was daily necessity, spiritual offering, and political theater all at once, an unbroken thread tying the city's people to the land, to their gods, and to each other. If the palaces, temples, and ziggurats of Babylon revealed the grandeur of the city, the family home revealed its beating heart. For all the wars, laws, and monuments, daily life ultimately revolved around love, kinship, and the bonds of family. Yet just as Babylonian walls were built of both sun-dried bricks and strong mortar, so too were relationships built of affection and duty, romance and contract, tenderness and control. To understand what it meant to live in Babylon, one must peer not only into the city's temples but also into its bedrooms and courtyards. Marriage in Babylon was not primarily a matter of passion, but of alliance and survival. For ordinary people, it was a union of households, a joining of property, and an arrangement carefully regulated by custom and law. The famous Code of Hammurabi, inscribed centuries before Babylon's peak yet still influential, laid out rules for dowries, inheritance, and marital responsibilities. A man might give gifts or bride price to a woman's family, while she brought a dowry of goods, land, or servants into the marriage. Contracts were written on clay tablets, sealed and witnessed, ensuring that marriage was as much a legal document as it was a personal bond. Yet within these contracts, space still existed for intimacy and affection. Letters survive from husbands to wives, written in cuneiform, expressing longing and tenderness. A soldier far from home might write to his wife, asking after her health and the welfare of their children, promising to return with gifts. Archaeologists have even found small amulets and figurines linked to love spells, suggesting that desire and attraction were as real in Babylon as in any age. Beneath the weight of law and duty, love could still flicker, surprising and ungovernable. For women, marriage defined much of life, yet their roles were not as passive as modern assumptions might suggest. Babylonian women could own property, engage in business, and even sue in court. A wife could bring a case against her husband if he neglected or abused her. In some contracts, women are recorded lending silver or running taverns. Still, patriarchy ruled, husbands were heads of households, and fidelity was demanded more from wives than from men. A woman caught in adultery could face severe punishment, while male infidelity was often overlooked unless it disrupted family honor. Children were both joy and necessity. Sons ensured the continuation of family lines and the inheritance of property, while daughters often strengthened ties through marriage. Infancy, however, was perilous. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed many young lives, making childbirth a moment of both hope and fear. Mothers relied on midwives, protective amulets, and prayers to goddesses like Gula, the deity of healing, to guard their infants. Surviving children were cherished, raised with stories of gods and heroes, taught to respect elders, and trained to one day manage farms, shops, or households. Love in Babylon was not confined to the walls of marriage. In taverns and markets, men and women mingled freely, and cuneiform poems reveal a culture not shy about celebrating lust and desire. Hymns to the goddess Ishtar, patroness of love and war, described her as both tender and fierce, a divine embodiment of erotic power. Through her, sexuality was sanctified, even dangerous. Some rituals in her temples may have included sacred unions, though historians debate their exact nature. What is clear is that Babylonians viewed desire as a force of both creation and destruction, one that bound humans to the gods and to each other. Prostitution, too, was part of the city's fabric. Tavern workers, entertainers, and women outside the bounds of marriage sometimes earned livelihoods this way. While later Greek and Roman writers exaggerated tales of sacred prostitution, Babylonian records paint a more nuanced picture. Sex could be transactional, yet it was also embedded in the social and economic life of the city. Women who worked in this way were not always outcasts, some even amassed property or earned independence. Still, stigma lingered, and the line between survival and exploitation was thin. Family life was not always idyllic. Divorce was possible and legally recognized. A husband might dismiss his wife for infertility, neglect, or conflict, but he was often required to return her dowry. Women, too, could seek divorce if their husbands failed in their duties. Inheritance disputes between siblings appear frequently on clay tablets, revealing tensions familiar even today: quarrels over property, accusations of favoritism, and the struggle to secure one's future. Domestic spaces themselves were shaped around these intimate relationships. Most families lived in small mud brick houses with central courtyards. Meals were shared on mats, children played in the dust, and grandparents passed down wisdom while weaving or grinding grain. Extended families often lived close together, weaving networks of obligation and support. In the evenings, stories of Gilgamesh and other heroes may have been told by lamplight, passing traditions from one generation to the next. At the same time, Babylon's streets also hid darker realities. Slavery was present in many households, with enslaved women sometimes serving as concubines. These relationships were rarely about love, instead reflecting the harsh inequalities of the city. War captives or debt slaves could find themselves absorbed into households, performing domestic labor or bearing children who sometimes inherited ambiguous status. For these individuals, love and family life were defined not by choice but by compulsion. Despite these complexities, Babylonians celebrated love openly in their literature. Poems liken kisses to honey, lovers to blooming gardens. Desire was not hidden in shame but embraced as part of life's natural order. One Sumerian predecessor to Babylonian poetry describes a bride and groom meeting in joyous, almost playful verse, proof that amid contracts and duties, there was room for genuine affection. Ultimately, the Babylonian vision of love and family was one of balance, between duty and desire, affection and obligation, passion and law. To be a Babylonian was to navigate these tensions daily, to sign contracts in clay yet whisper words of tenderness at night, to honor the gods of fertility while fearing the pain of childbirth, to raise children with hope even as mortality loomed, to find companionship in marriage while temptation beckoned beyond its walls. In these small, human moments, Babylon comes alive more vividly than in its towering walls or carved stelae. The city was not only a place of kings and armies but also of husbands and wives, parents and children, lovers and friends. To imagine a Babylonian sitting in the quiet of a courtyard, cradling a child, or exchanging a glance with a beloved, is to see that across thousands of years, their lives were not so different from our own. If love and family formed the intimate core of Babylonian life, work and labor defined its outward rhythm. The city itself was a living organism, and its people were the heartbeat that kept it alive: farmers in the fields, builders on scaffolds, scribes scratching tablets, merchants haggling in markets. Each man, woman, and child played a role in sustaining the grand illusion of order that Babylon projected to the world. Yet beneath the gilded facades and ceremonial processions lay the daily grind, marked by sweat, wages, and the constant struggle to survive. At its foundation, Babylon rested on agriculture. The fertile alluvial plains along the Euphrates provided rich soil, but harnessing it required immense human effort. Fields had to be plowed, canals dug, and dikes maintained to control the waters that could both nourish and destroy. Farmers rose before dawn, guiding oxen across the fields, scattering seeds, and praying to the gods of rain and fertility. The irrigation system, so often praised as the secret of Mesopotamian civilization, was not an abstract marvel but the result of backbreaking labor. Droughts or floods could undo months of work, plunging families into hunger or debt. For the farmer, survival depended on endless toil and the unpredictable moods of nature. Beyond the fields, Babylon thrived as a center of craft and trade. Artisans filled its streets with the sounds of hammering, weaving, and carving. Potters shaped clay into vessels that carried beer and oil, while smiths forged tools and weapons in smoky workshops. Textile production was particularly important, with women spinning wool and weaving cloth that was traded across the empire. Each profession had its guild-like networks, passing skills from master to apprentice. Some craftsmen were respected, even wealthy, but many struggled to earn enough to feed their families. Their hands shaped the goods that made Babylon famous, yet their names rarely entered history. In the bustling markets, merchants haggled over goods from across the ancient world. Babylon's central location made it a hub for trade routes stretching from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Copper, tin, lapis lazuli, ivory, spices, and precious woods flowed through its gates. Merchants dealt in silver, the common measure of value, though barter still thrived in daily exchanges. For the ambitious, trade offered opportunity. Fortunes could be made in a single caravan, yet risk loomed in every journey, from bandits on desert roads to storms on the Gulf. At the same time, small-scale vendors lined the markets with dates, onions, and fish, their cries filling the air, surviving on the coins of ordinary citizens. Wages varied widely depending on profession and status. Clay tablets reveal that a common laborer might earn rations of grain and beer rather than silver, while skilled artisans could command higher pay. State projects, like building temples or maintaining canals, often relied on forced labor from prisoners, debtors, or conscripted citizens. These workers endured long days under harsh overseers, their efforts swallowed by monumental projects that glorified kings rather than fed their own families. The inequality was stark. While palace scribes calculated salaries in neat rows of cuneiform, countless workers toiled in anonymity. Debt was a constant shadow. A poor harvest or unexpected expense could force a farmer to borrow grain or silver, pledging his land or even his children as collateral. If repayment failed, families could fall into debt slavery, serving creditors until obligations were met. Laws like Hammurabi's tried to regulate such practices, limiting the length of servitude or protecting widows and orphans, yet the reality often favored the wealthy. For the poor, life was a delicate balancing act between survival and ruin, one misfortune away from bondage. Not all labor was drudgery, however. Certain professions carried prestige. Scribes, trained in the complex art of cuneiform writing, stood apart from ordinary workers. Their education was grueling, but their rewards included stable income, influence, and access to the corridors of power. Priests, too, enjoyed authority, managing temple lands and offerings. Soldiers, though often conscripted, could rise in rank or gain spoils in war. Yet for every respected scribe or priest, thousands of anonymous workers bent over fields, carried bricks, or wove cloth in dim courtyards. Daily struggles extended beyond wages to the body itself. The laboring poor endured injuries, exhaustion, and disease. Without modern medicine, a simple infection could prove fatal. Herbal remedies, incantations, and prayers to healing gods offered some relief, but many lives were cut short by the harshness of work. Children were often put to labor early, helping in fields or workshops, their small hands learning skills that ensured survival. Old age, for those who reached it, was often marked by poverty unless family support could soften the decline. Amid this hardship, community offered resilience. Workers shared beer in taverns, neighbors exchanged labor during harvests, and festivals provided moments of collective joy. On holy days, even the poorest could gather to watch processions, eat communal meals, and feel part of something larger than themselves. These moments of respite did not erase inequality but gave meaning to lives otherwise ruled by toil. For women, labor was both domestic and economic. Within households, they ground grain, baked bread, brewed beer, and raised children. Yet many also worked outside the home, weaving, selling goods, or managing taverns. Some temple women served as scribes or administrators, while others brewed beer for offerings. Though restricted by patriarchal law, women's work was indispensable, woven into every aspect of Babylonian survival. Slavery formed the harshest tier of labor. War captives or debt slaves worked in households, fields, or construction. While some could eventually gain freedom, many lived and died in servitude. Their names are rarely preserved, but their labor built the canals, baked the bricks, and served the meals that sustained Babylonian life. For them, the city's splendor was a daily reminder of their own lack of freedom. When we think of Babylon's grandeur, the soaring ziggurats, the hanging gardens of legend, the bustling avenues, we must remember the hands that built and maintained it all. Behind every monument lay thousands of backs bent under loads of clay and stone. Behind every feast lay the work of farmers, brewers, and cooks. Behind every tablet of law or literature lay the training of scribes and the toil of clay gatherers. The city's magnificence was inseparable from the daily struggles of its people. In the end, the story of work in Babylon is not one of triumph but of endurance. The laborers who rose each dawn to toil in fields or markets did not dream of immortality, they dreamed of full bellies, healthy children, and relief from debt. Their struggles, recorded only faintly in contracts and ration lists, were the true foundation of Babylon's greatness. Without them, the city of kings and gods would have been nothing more than dust beside the Euphrates. To walk the streets of Babylon was to walk through a world where the divine touched everything. From the rising of the sun to the blowing of the evening winds, the people of Babylon believed their lives were woven into the will of the gods. Faith was not a matter of private belief but a collective lens through which the entire city understood reality. Every temple, every ritual, every whispered prayer tied human survival to a cosmic order that was both majestic and terrifying. At the heart of Babylon's religious life stood Marduk, the city's patron god. His temple, the Esagila, loomed near the great ziggurat known as Etemenenki, a towering structure that some believe later inspired the biblical tale of the Tower of Babel. To the Babylonians, Marduk was no distant deity, he was the very reason their city existed, the one who had defeated chaos in the primordial time and brought order to the universe. Festivals in his honor, particularly the Akita New Year festival, reaffirmed Babylon's place at the center of the cosmos. During these ceremonies, the king himself was stripped of his regalia, humbled before Marduk, and then reinstated, his authority validated by the god's blessing. In this cycle of ritual humiliation and renewal, political power was bound to divine approval. But Babylonian religion was not limited to Marduk. Their pantheon was vast, filled with gods and goddesses representing every aspect of nature and human life. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, embodied passion and destruction in equal measure. Shamash, the sun god, was the divine judge who saw all things and brought justice. Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom, was revered by scribes, while Ea, god of water and knowledge, guarded humanity with cunning and invention. To be Babylonian was to navigate a universe alive with divine forces, each demanding reverence, offerings, and rituals. Temples dominated the cityscape, not only as places of worship but as economic and political centers. They owned land, collected taxes, employed workers, and redistributed food. Priests oversaw these vast operations, managing both spiritual and material wealth. Ordinary citizens came to temples with offerings of bread, beer, or livestock, hoping to gain favor or avert disaster. To the gods, the people gave sustenance. In return, they prayed for health, fertility, and protection from enemies. Temples were thus both banks and sacred spaces, blending the divine and the practical in one institution. Religion in Babylon was not confined to grand temples or state ceremonies, it infiltrated every corner of daily life through superstition and divination. The Babylonians believed that the will of the gods could be read in signs if one knew where to look. Priests and diviners studied the stars, the flight of birds, even the livers of sacrificed animals to glimpse the future. These practices, called hepatoscopy or astrology, were not superstition in the way we might dismiss them today but highly respected sciences, integral to decision-making at every level of society. Kings delayed battles or launched campaigns based on omens. Merchants consulted astrologers before embarking on journeys. For the Babylonians, fate was written in the heavens, and the gods communicated through the world itself. Superstition shaped even the smallest details of life. Amulets were worn to ward off evil spirits. Incantations were muttered before drinking water or entering new houses. Illness was often attributed to the wrath of gods or the malice of demons, requiring both medical remedies and spiritual interventions. The line between religion and magic blurred. A fever might be treated with herbs, but also with a ritual in which a figurine of the demon was cast into fire or water, symbolically banishing the affliction. Fear of the unseen hung over every household, yet so did the comfort of rituals designed to protect. The gods were imagined as both protectors and tormentors. They could bless a harvest or send a plague, grant victory or bring defeat. In myths, they quarreled and schemed much like humans, their tempers unpredictable and their demands endless. For ordinary Babylonians, this meant living in a constant state of negotiation with the divine. Every prayer, offering, and ritual was an attempt to secure favor or at least avoid disaster. To forget the gods was dangerous, to displease them could be fatal. Faith was less about love and more about survival in a cosmos ruled by powerful, often capricious beings. One of the most striking features of Babylonian religion was its relationship with death. Unlike later traditions promising paradise or eternal reward, Babylonians imagined the afterlife as a bleak underworld. Souls descended to a shadowy realm ruled by Ereshkigal, where they lived on dust and darkness. No matter one's deeds in life, the underworld offered little comfort. This somber vision made the present world all the more significant. Life was a brief chance to honor the gods, enjoy family, and secure one's legacy. Tomb inscriptions and burial rituals reflected this reality, focusing less on the promise of heaven and more on the duty of the living to remember and care for the dead through offerings. Festivals, however, provided moments of collective joy amid these fears. The Akita festival was the most famous, but countless smaller rituals filled the calendar. Agricultural festivals marked planting and harvest, weddings were accompanied by hymns to Ishtar, and military victories were celebrated with processions of idols through the streets. These occasions allowed the entire city to participate in the drama of divine-human relations, binding the community together in shared belief. The sight of priests carrying sacred statues through Babylon's avenues, incense filling the air, chants echoing against mud-brick walls, must have been unforgettable for those who lived it. Religion also served as a justification for the vast inequalities of Babylonian society. Kings claimed divine mandate, laws were said to come from Shamash, and social hierarchies were framed as reflections of cosmic order. To resist authority was not only rebellion against rulers but defiance against the gods themselves. Yet religion also gave the poor tools of resistance, incantations, prayers, and rituals that offered protection against the power of both demons and kings. It was at once a system of control and a source of comfort, a double-edged force shaping every aspect of existence. Ultimately, Babylonian faith reveals a worldview in which the sacred and the ordinary were inseparable. To farm a field was to serve Ea, to render justice was to honor Shamash, to make love was to embody Ishtar. Superstition and devotion merged into a single fabric of meaning, binding the people of Babylon to their gods and to one another. To modern eyes, their world may seem haunted by fear and dominated by ritual, but to them, it was a cosmos alive with power and purpose. Every omen, every prayer, every sacrifice was part of a grand negotiation between humanity and the divine. When we imagine Babylon today, with its ziggurats rising above the plain and its markets humming with life, we must also imagine the unseen, the the whispered incantations, the prayers carried on incense smoke, the eyes lifted to the stars in search of meaning. For the Babylonians, to live was to believe, and to believe was to survive in a universe ruled by gods who never slept. Babylon was a city of laws, perhaps more so than any other in the ancient world. To its rulers, order was sacred, a fragile barrier between civilization and chaos. Behind the walls and temples, however, lay the constant possibility of theft, betrayal, and violence. In a city teeming with traders, farmers, slaves, and nobles, conflict was inevitable. What set Babylon apart was not that crime existed, it always does, but that the Babylonians enshrined their response to it in tablets of clay and stone, building one of the earliest systems of written law in human history. The most famous of these is the Code of Hammurabi, a collection of nearly 300 laws carved into a black basalt stele centuries before Babylon reached its peak but still echoed through its courts and institutions. This monument depicts King Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god and divine judge. The message was clear: laws were not mere human inventions, but sacred commands rooted in cosmic justice. Every thief, liar, or murderer was not only breaking society's rules but offending the gods themselves. The code and its successors covered a dizzying range of offenses. Theft of livestock, damage to canals, adultery, false accusations, disputes over wages, inheritance quarrels, all had prescribed outcomes. What stands out is the harshness and precision of these laws. Justice in Babylon was rarely gentle. It was direct, public, and often brutal. The famous principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was no metaphor. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's own son might be executed. If a surgeon killed a patient during an operation, his hands could be cut off. Punishment was not always about the individual but about restoring balance and demonstrating that wrongdoing would not go unanswered. Property crimes were treated with particular severity. In a society where survival depended on fields, herds, and trade, theft was seen as an attack on the very fabric of life. A man caught stealing grain or tools could face mutilation or death. Even harboring runaway slaves was a crime punishable by law. Contracts and receipts, written in cuneiform on clay, were not mere records but weapons of protection, ensuring that disputes over loans, wages, or land could be settled with evidence. Babylonian justice was a system of accountability, but also of fear, an ever-present reminder that the city's order rested on obedience. Not all punishments were physical. Fines and restitution were common, especially for damage to property or lesser disputes. If a man destroyed another's crops by diverting water, he might repay in grain. If a fight left a man injured, the attacker could be fined in silver. These fines served both as deterrents and as a way to keep conflicts from spiraling into vendettas. Yet the scale of punishment often reflected class. Nobles who injured other nobles might face heavy penalties, but crimes against commoners sometimes carried lesser consequences. Babylonian justice, for all its severity, was not blind, it reinforced hierarchy as much as it maintained order. Trials themselves reveal the drama of Babylonian justice. Judges presided in public spaces, often temples, where witnesses were summoned and oaths sworn before the gods. To lie under oath was to risk divine wrath as well as legal punishment. Sometimes the gods were called upon to judge directly. In cases of doubt, a suspect might be thrown into the river. If he drowned, he was guilty; if he survived, the gods had acquitted him. This ordeal by water demonstrates the deep entanglement of religion and law. Human courts enforce justice, but ultimate judgment belonged to the divine. Babylon's streets were patrolled less by professional police than by communal enforcement. Neighbors reported crimes, elders heard disputes, and temple officials enforced rulings. Yet corruption was a constant danger. Records exist of bribes offered to judges, of false witnesses manipulating outcomes. To combat this, laws prescribed punishments for dishonest officials, but in practice, the poor often bore the brunt of injustice while the wealthy maneuvered within the system. Women, too, were bound tightly by legal codes. Adultery was one of the gravest offenses a wife could commit, punishable by drowning or execution. A man's infidelity was less scrutinized unless it endangered family honor or inheritance. Yet women were not without recourse. A neglected wife could seek divorce, and widows were protected from losing their dowries. Still, the double standards reveal a society where justice reinforced patriarchal control as much as it protected the vulnerable. Slaves faced an even harsher reality. Runaways were hunted relentlessly, and those who aided them faced severe consequences. Masters could punish slaves brutally, though killing one without cause was frowned upon since it represented loss of property rather than a moral crime. For the enslaved, law was less protection than a chain binding them more tightly to their masters. Despite its brutality, Babylonian justice had a certain logic. The fear of harsh punishment kept order in a vast and diverse society. Farmers who knew that canal damage could bring fines worked more carefully. Builders, threatened with death if their houses collapsed, built with precision. Merchants, aware that contracts were enforceable, conducted trade with confidence. Justice in Babylon was as much about deterrence and spectacle as about fairness. Every execution, mutilation, or fine was a reminder that the gods and the king guarded order with an unblinking eye. For ordinary citizens, the law was a mixture of fear and reassurance. On one hand, they knew that a careless mistake or false accusation could ruin their lives. On the other, they could take some comfort in the knowledge that disputes could be resolved not just by personal vengeance but by an established system. In this sense, the Code of Hammurabi and its successors were not only instruments of control but also early steps toward a shared sense of justice, however unevenly applied. The darker side of this system is impossible to ignore. Justice was swift and public, designed to terrify as much as to correct. The sight of a thief's hands being severed, or a criminal cast into the river, was as much theater as punishment. It reminded the crowds that Babylon's greatness rested not only on faith and labor but on the harsh hand of law. For the rulers, justice was another tool of power; for the people, it was both shield and sword, protecting them from chaos while always threatening their own survival. In the end, the story of crime and punishment in Babylon is one of contrasts: order and fear, fairness and brutality, divine will and human corruption. The clay tablets that record these laws may seem cold, but behind them were living people, terrified thieves, desperate debtors, injured farmers, grieving families, all navigating a system as merciless as it was necessary. To live in Babylon was to live under the constant gaze of gods and kings, knowing that justice was both your protector and your executioner. War was woven into the lifeblood of Babylon. For all its soaring temples, bustling markets, and orderly laws, the city's fortunes were repeatedly forged on the battlefield. Every brick of its walls, every treasure in its storerooms, every slave in its workshops carried the shadow of conquest. The Babylonians did not exist in isolation; they lived in a turbulent world of rival city-states, nomadic raiders, and ambitious empires. Survival meant not only defending their city but also striking out to dominate others before being consumed themselves. To understand what life was truly like in Babylon, one must step into the dust of the battlefield, hear the clash of bronze weapons, and watch as armies moved like storms across Mesopotamia. The roots of Babylon's military culture stretched deep into Mesopotamian tradition. From Sumerian times, rulers relied on citizen militias drawn from farming communities, men who traded plows for spears when war came. But as Babylon grew into an imperial power, its armies became more professional, more disciplined, and more feared. Kings like Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE and Nebuchadnezzar II a millennium later understood that war was both a necessity and a performance, a way to display strength, secure borders, and legitimize rule under the eyes of the gods. The Babylonian army was not a single monolithic force but a layered structure. At its base were conscripts, ordinary men compelled to serve for part of the year. These were farmers, craftsmen, and herders, temporarily pulled from their daily lives to march with the king. They provided manpower but lacked elite training. Alongside them stood professional soldiers, often stationed in garrisons or rewarded with plots of land in exchange for lifelong service. These men formed the backbone of Babylon's military machine, trained to handle bows, spears, and chariots with deadly precision. Chariots were the pride of Mesopotamian armies. These two-wheeled vehicles, pulled by sturdy horses or onagers, carried archers who could rain down arrows while moving at speed. To see a Babylonian chariot charge was to witness terror embodied, wheels cutting through the dust, horses foaming at the mouth, archers firing volleys into fleeing ranks. Chariots were expensive, symbols of wealth and prestige as much as tools of war, and their presence on the battlefield often signaled which side held dominance. Infantry, however, formed the true mass of Babylonian armies. Armed with spears, axes, and bows, these men fought in tightly organized ranks. Some carried large shields, forming protective walls against enemy projectiles. Others specialized as archers, raining arrows before charging forward. Armor was typically made of leather, sometimes reinforced with bronze scales, though the wealthiest could afford helmets and metal breastplates. Ordinary soldiers often marched with little more than a shield and weapon, their survival depending less on equipment and more on discipline, numbers, and divine favor. Warfare in Babylon was not only about open battle. Sieges were a grim reality. City-states across Mesopotamia were surrounded by formidable walls, and conquering them required patience, engineering, and brutality. Babylonian armies built ramps, deployed battering rams, and attempted to cut off supplies, forcing enemies into starvation. Siege warfare was slow, but its impact was devastating: famine, disease, and eventual slaughter if resistance continued. For civilians trapped inside, life during a siege was a nightmare of hunger and fear. For Babylonian soldiers outside the walls, it was a waiting game of attrition, broken only by moments of violent assault. Campaigns were not fought solely for glory or defense. War was also economic. Victorious armies seized land, plundered goods, and captured people. Conquered populations were often deported, resettled within Babylonian territory to weaken resistance and provide labor. This practice became infamous during Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, when the people of Judah were exiled after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. These captives, known in later history as the exiles of Babylon, became part of the empire's vast mosaic of peoples, their fates bound to Babylon's ambitions. For Babylonians, such deportations brought fresh workers, soldiers, and tribute into the empire. For the conquered, it meant the end of worlds. Religion infused every aspect of war. Kings claimed that their campaigns were commanded by the gods, especially Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. Before battle, rituals were performed, sacrifices made, omens read in the livers of animals or in the stars above. Victory was seen not merely as military success but as proof of divine favor. Defeat, conversely, was interpreted as punishment for sin or failure to honor the gods properly. Soldiers marched to battle not only with weapons in hand but with the weight of cosmic expectation on their shoulders. The human cost of war was immense. For the ordinary Babylonian conscript, a campaign meant leaving family and fields behind, often for months at a time. If they survived, they returned with scars, stories, or sometimes spoils. If they fell, their families could be left destitute. Wives prayed in temples for the safe return of their husbands. Children grew up with fathers who were absent for years or gone forever. War shaped not only the political map of Mesopotamia but also the rhythms of daily life in Babylon's homes. War also left its mark on the city itself. Victories brought wealth, filling temples with offerings and treasuries with silver. Triumphs were celebrated with processions, music, and feasts, reinforcing the king's glory. Defeats, however, brought dread. When foreign armies threatened Babylon, the city's walls became both shield and prison. Citizens prepared for sieges, rationing grain and fearing famine. Invasions by the Hittites, Assyrians, and Persians over the centuries left deep scars, reminding Babylonians that even the greatest city was vulnerable. The psychological weight of war was constant. Stories and myths reflected this reality. Epic poems, like those echoing from earlier Mesopotamian traditions, glorified heroes who conquered chaos and enemies alike. Yet beneath the grand narratives lay the everyday reality of men trudging across scorching plains, bleeding on battlefields, and watching friends die. For the elites, war meant prestige, tribute, and monuments. For commoners, it often meant hardship, loss, and forced obedience. By Nebuchadnezzar II's reign in the 6th century BCE, Babylon had reached the height of its military and imperial power. Its armies stretched across the Near East, subjugating rivals and enforcing tribute. Yet this power was temporary. Just decades later, Cyrus the Great of Persia would march into Babylon without a major battle, claiming the city in 539 BCE. Despite its long history of warfare, Babylon eventually fell not in a blaze of resistance but in a quiet surrender, as weary citizens welcomed a new master who promised stability. The legacy of Babylon's wars is written in ruins and exile, in the stories of conquered peoples and the enduring memory of a city that once ruled by force of arms as much as by divine decree. For Babylonians themselves, war was unavoidable, a duty and a destiny. It was both the engine of their greatness and the shadow that haunted their every triumph. To live in Babylon was to live with war at your doorstep, whether as a soldier on the march, a farmer watching the horizon for invaders, or a child growing up in a city whose very identity was built on conquest. For all its laws, wars, and daily struggles, Babylon was not merely a place of toil and terror. It was also a city of joy, spectacle, and communal celebration. Life in the ancient city pulsed not only with the demands of labor but with moments of release, festivals that transformed the streets into theaters of ritual, music, and excess, feasts where food and drink flowed like rivers, games and amusements that allowed Babylonians to forget, even briefly, the weight of gods and kings. Entertainment in Babylon was never just frivolous, it was cultural glue, a way of reinforcing identity, devotion, and hierarchy while satisfying the human craving for pleasure. One of the most significant outlets for joy was the calendar itself. The Babylonian year was structured by cycles of festivals, each tied to the rhythms of agriculture and the will of the gods. These events were not optional diversions but essential parts of civic and religious life. The most famous of them all was the New Year festival, known as the Akitu. This massive celebration, held in the spring, marked both the renewal of the seasons and the reaffirmation of the king's divine authority. The Akitu festival lasted days, sometimes weeks, and involved elaborate rituals. The statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, was carried from his temple in the city to a special house built outside the walls, symbolizing his journey into the underworld and return to life. The king himself was ritually humbled, stripped of royal garments, slapped by a priest, and made to swear his worthiness before the god. If tears were shed in this ritual humiliation, it was taken as a sign that Marduk approved, and the king's reign would continue with divine blessing. For the people, this festival was both cosmic theater and civic carnival. Processions filled the streets, offerings poured into temples, and the city rejoiced as the gods themselves seemed to walk among them. Other festivals punctuated the year as well. Seasonal events tied to planting and harvest brought communities together in ritual feasts. Gods associated with fertility, weather, or protection were honored with music, sacrifices, and celebrations that blurred the line between the sacred and the joyous. For Babylonians, entertainment was never entirely secular. To sing, to feast, to play, these were also acts of devotion, ways of weaving themselves into the cosmic order upheld by their deities. Feasting itself was a central form of entertainment, and it was not limited to festivals. Banquets were opportunities for elites to display wealth and power, for families to bond, and for communities to mark special occasions. The wealthy enjoyed meals heavy with roasted meats, bread, cheese, honey, and an array of fruits and vegetables drawn from the fertile soil of Mesopotamia. Beer was the most common drink, consumed daily by rich and poor alike, but wine, more expensive and imported, was reserved for the upper classes or sacred rituals. At feasts, drinking could become competitive, with music and dancing accompanying the raising of mugs. For ordinary Babylonians, feasts were simpler but still joyous: bread baked fresh, dates sweet as candy, lentils and onions flavored with herbs. Even a humble meal could become a celebration when shared in good company. Music and dance animated many of these gatherings. The Babylonians played harps, lyres, drums, and flutes, filling both temples and taverns with rhythm. Songs ranged from hymns of praise to playful, even bawdy tunes. Dancers swayed in ritual patterns, sometimes telling stories through movement, other times simply giving themselves over to the joy of the moment. Professional entertainers existed, but music was also part of daily life: a farmer singing in the fields, a mother humming to her child, a worker tapping rhythm on clay jars. The city was alive with sound. For those seeking more playful diversions, games offered amusement. Archaeological discoveries from Mesopotamia include dice, board games, and gambling pieces, suggesting that Babylonians enjoyed strategy and chance. One of the most famous games was the royal game of Ur, already centuries old by the time Babylon rose to prominence. Played with dice and patterned boards, it was part pastime, part ritual, sometimes even linked to divination. To throw dice in Babylon was not just to gamble but to peer into fate itself. Children, too, had toys, clay animals, miniature carts, and simple playthings that reveal a lighter side of life in a city so often imagined as stern and solemn. Taverns offered another layer of entertainment, though with a reputation for both joy and danger. Here, ordinary citizens gathered to drink beer, gossip, sing, and play games. Taverns were social equalizers of a kind, where merchants, laborers, and even women could mingle. Yet they also carried a stigma: too much drinking, too much gambling, too much mixing of classes could lead to trouble. Babylonian law codes often mention taverns, reflecting the anxieties they provoked. Still, for many, these establishments provided escape from the rigid hierarchies of daily life. Public spectacles also played a role. Victory processions after wars filled the streets with displays of spoils, prisoners, and glory. Religious rituals staged in open courtyards drew massive crowds, transforming the city itself into a stage. Even executions, brutal as they were, had a performative element, reminders of justice delivered before the eyes of the people. Entertainment, in Babylon, could be both joyous and grim, a reflection of the full spectrum of human experience. For children, entertainment was woven into daily life. Clay tablets reveal riddles, proverbs, and stories passed down as both education and amusement. Tales of Gilgamesh and other heroes were recited not just in temples but in households, teaching values while sparking imagination. To grow up in Babylon was to inherit not only a culture of law and war but also one of story, song, and play. At the heart of all this entertainment lay attention, joy and control. Festivals bound the people together but also reaffirmed the king's authority. Feasts offered pleasure but reinforced social hierarchy through who could afford what. Games amused but also reflected a worldview obsessed with fate and divine will. In Babylon, even leisure was never fully separate from power and belief. And yet, in those moments of laughter, music, and celebration, Babylonians revealed their humanity most vividly. Behind the laws and armies, they were people who danced in the streets, sang to their gods, raised mugs of beer in noisy taverns, and watched the stars during night festivals. For all its grandeur and darkness, Babylon was also a city of joy, a place where the burdens of empire could, for a time, be set aside in the shared pleasures of feast and festival.